lot smaller now. So, but you know, at the end of the day, we hope for a speedy recovery for Kev and get back on the floor as soon as he can. But it's a tough blow for us.
What kind of impact does that have in the moment when you find out what it is?
It sucks. It sucks big time. There's nothing you can do about it. Obviously, it's injuries is a part of the game, and it's unfortunate, for our team, and obviously with everything that's been going on as of late, with our ball coach just trying to figure out, how we're gonna play every night, our different lineups, and getting everybody into the flow. When you have Kev go out like that, he's gonna be out for quite a while, maybe 2 months. It's just tough.
Now back to First Take.
Antonietta, thank you. LeBron speaking out on what he perceives to be a double standard between players and front offices. Max, he's always calculated, and I don't mean that as a slight. So what do you think this means for LeBron's future in Cleveland?
Well, he could be reminding people that his future, his fate is in his own hands, and he will choose and not be tied to a certain location, because until he came around, that's been the tradition in American team sports, specifically in the NBA. Magic or Bird would have never gone to join the enemy the way LeBron did when he joined up with Dwayne Wade, pairing two of the best three players on earth on the same team with another perennial all-star in Chris Bosh. I understand that. But I agree with LeBron, Stephen A., and I always have. When a GM does it, that's okay. But when a player, because his team won't get him the requisite help he needs to get to the finals or win, when a player actually acts as his own GM, that's a problem, and that's because we've been conditioned. People have been conditioned to think if an executive does it, it's okay. That's the way it's supposed to be done. You just stay in your place, worker. But if someone who works for a living takes their fate into their own hands, takes control of their destiny, there's something wrong with that. Don't worry about that. Stay in your lane. That's not for you to decide. And LeBron James changed that, I think. And that did not sit well with some, but I think others are getting used to it. And I think he's absolutely right about it.
He's 1,000% correct, and he's putting the world on notice that he will make his decision and he won't feel guilty about whatever decision that he makes. It was a 52-year drought before the city of Cleveland was able to capture a championship in any professional sport. He ended that drought by delivering an NBA championship to the city for the first time in more than a half century. So he owes the city nothing, and he wanted to make sure that everybody knows that. From what I'm hearing, in one breath, you have some executives in the league who believe that LeBron James is staying and is going to try to get Chris Paul to depart from Houston to come to Cleveland, because obviously, Chris Paul's the godfather of his children and what have you, and they're very close, and that's something that he would love to have happen. There are others that tell me that LeBron James will end up in Houston with James Harden and Chris Paul, as opposed to Chris Paul coming to Cleveland. So we don't know what that story is. But Max Kellerman, I also agree with you for the biggest reason of all. Let's just call it what it is. LeBron James doesn't want to say it, so I'll say it for him. African-American players are held to a different standard. The reality is that in the sport of football and basketball, you're expected to be appreciative of your position. How dare you take the bull by the horn and take control of your own future? If you do so, you are labeled disloyal and what have you. And we're usually talking about African-American players when they go that route, because you're talking about individuals who, by and large, come from impoverished backgrounds. And as a result, people believe that because of the privileged position that they're in, it ain't their talents, it ain't their greatness, it's the privilege that they had of being lucky and fortunate enough to be in these situations to make this amount of money. They should therefore recognize the level of appreciation that they should have and act accordingly. Black players are held to a different standard, and on far too many occasions, anytime they do something that deviates from what we're accustomed to seeing as it pertains to institutional control, and they exhibit a maverick kind of tendency, and they step out and step forward and remind the world that they've earned the right to make their own decisions and what have you, we sit up there and we label them in a different way. Now, this is entirely different. Kevin Durant, all that stuff with Golden State. I was talking about the team he went to, but his choice, his freedom to leave. People bring that up, but with LeBron and those other guys, they sit up there and they lament that, and they do speak to disloyalty, and they don't do that with executives, and they don't do that with owners.
I want to address the racial component here because there is a racial dimension to it, but I don't think it's independent of, or rather it's related to the idea that I brought up. In other words, this applies to labor generally in this country. One kind of means of control culturally is to tell labor, stay in your lane. Don't worry about your, Mr. So-and-so, the executive will figure that out. Now, the fact that oppression of African Americans and the institutional oppression that still reverberates and still exists in many respects, but certainly reverberates from this country's original sin, means that out of proportion to their numbers, African Americans will be in positions of labor versus management. And so in that way, it is especially racial. And it's also probably amplified whatever kind of bad feelings people have about labor taking their destiny into their own hands, especially when it's very well compensated labor, is probably amplified in their own minds if it's an African-American subject we're discussing, an African-American person we're discussing. Well, but I think that would apply to a white player too. Maybe not to the same extent, maybe yes. It would apply to a white player too if they tried to take their destiny in their own hands, join a super team, etc.
Not the same, not the same level of vitriol, and actually, as a result, Max, we could exactly. That's all I'm saying. It's not the same. I'm not saying it doesn't apply to folks that are white at all. I'm simply saying not to the same degree. And let's take into account what we just talked about the other day. The NBA, for example, who has an incredible record in terms of diversity and what have you, and should be applauded. Even in the NBA, what are we seeing right now? We're seeing a plethora of African American players. They make up about 74%. You take into account international players of color, that number jumps to 80%. As it pertains to players. But the number of African-American coaches have dissipated. The number of black executives have dissipated. Don't get me started with ownership. And not to mention the fact it's even gotten to the point where you're talking about reporters and what have you. The insiders, the people that executives communicate with, the people who are doing the hiring, the analytics dudes. It's white all over the place. And they're in positions of influence and power, and African-American players are considered essentially laborers until LeBron James reminds them this is a different age and we're not going to be just that, which is why I applaud him coming out and speaking and reminding people of that.
And let's put it this way. Back in the day when there was the reserve clause in Major League Baseball, before integration, after integration, even when a white player would hold out, Mickey Mantle or Joe DiMaggio, why? He makes $100,000 a year and I make $5,000. How dare, who does he think he is? It would likely have been worse if it was a black player, because then on top of everything else, you add the term back then and maybe even now for some uppity. There's this sense that you're not staying in your lane, and that's compounded by race, I'm sure. I agree with that analysis. Quickly, I want to say about the Rockets, and bringing CP3 to Cleveland, Stephen A. I find that much less likely that LeBron could lure CP3 to Cleveland, a cold weather Rust Belt city, right? And a lesser team right now than CP3 could lure LeBron to a warm weather huge market in Houston that right now, if they added LeBron, I think would run roughshod over the West, including Golden State.
His hometown.
We know that, but I told you what the executives are talking about. They're talking about those two scenarios. That's what they're saying they believe is going on. I happen to believe if LeBron leaves, he's going to Houston, but we don't know whether or not he'll leave. It remains to be seen.
We shall see. And LeBron, the right person to be sending that message that he did. James Harden, though, gentlemen.